Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We're starting a brand new book this week, and we are in the New Testament, and we're going to be working our way over the next 5 weeks through
1 Corinthians.
The book of 1 Corinthians.
Yeah. I love this book, and I'm not sure why. But we were talking before, I really like Corinth and the whole idea of the city and just all the things that were going on in there. It was really amazing. And if you've never taken a look at the city, Corinth is a city in Greece. Just bring up Google Maps and you know, for me, it shows up in Indiana, and then you zoom out, you move over a large body of water, you find the lake, that's Italy, you know, and you start zooming in, and Greece will be on the right there a little bit.
And it's still called Corinth today.
Yeah, it is.
So, you know, a lot of names have changed in the past 2,000 years, but this one you can still see a thriving Corinth.
Yeah, well, and it's a port city.
Yep.
And what I never realized is Greece is kind of two parts. And there's this little thing called an isthmus, a land bridge going there that's about a half-mile wide, and Corinth is right there. And I think it's moved because there was earthquakes or anything. But the deal is, anybody trying to get on the other side of the water, you had to go this half-mile stretch. So part of Corinth's money that was coming in is they ported goods from one side to the other. So that was a big thing they had. And in fact, if you do go out there and zoom in, there's now this canal in there. And it was like, oh. And then all of a sudden you realized, how is this thing so straight? And you realize it's a man-made canal doing that.
But you know they're charging for it.
Oh, yeah,
and,
right.
You know,
so the amount of money coming into this town was unbelievable. And because of these two big land masses, anybody going from one side or the other has to go through Corinth. So it was a big hub. And you had everybody there, right? So you had the people coming in on the ships, so all denominations, all different faiths in there. You would have had the Roman gods, you would have had the Greek gods, you know, because they were in Greece. But also Rome had a garrison there, so you know there would have been a Roman influence in there. Man, everything going on.
You would have had Europeans,
just melting pot.
North Africans right across the Mediterranean Sea, Middle Easterners coming over. There was a huge Jewish constituency, and so when Paul got there, he always went to the synagogue first. Right. Wherever he went, he always went to the synagogue first to see if he could convince the Jews of Jesus being the Messiah. Right. And then he would open it up to the rest of the Gentiles. Yeah.
So Paul, that's exactly what Paul did, right? And he was teaching in the synagogue for quite a while, and finally the Jewish leadership went, this isn't right. And they actually kicked him out of the church.
Yeah.
So
the synagogue.
Yeah, sorry.
Right.
So it seems like he went next door and started preaching out of a house.
Yeah.
Which really had to bother him.
So where do we find this?
In the book of Acts.
Yeah, right.
Around 18?
Yeah, Acts chapter 18 gives us the history of how Paul got to Corinth. This was after his time in Athens.
Right.
Okay, and Athens is not too far. Actually, you just pop across the street almost.
Yeah.
You get over to Corinth. Athens is where, in chapter 17, he was up on the Areopagus, Mars Hill. Really a bad reception in Athens. So he goes over to Corinth, and chapter 8
had to leave quick.
Yeah.
Right? One of those.
Yeah, chapter 18 tells us that he was really worried about what was going on in Philippi and Thessalonica, and he hadn't heard back from Timothy yet. And so when he gets to Corinth, he's somewhat muted, he's depressed, maybe not depressed, but he's sort of, his ministry was really, didn't start well in Corinth.
Right.
Acts chapter 18 tells us he finally heard from Timothy, and things started going. Yeah, he got encouraged. He got perked up, and then his ministry really took off here.
Yeah, and Luke records he had a good ministry for at least 2 years. In there.
Yeah.
Right. So Paul starts the church, stays for an extended period of time, and then he actually moves on, and he's in Ephesus, and there's a couple correspondents that come back, and we happen to call them 1st and 2nd Corinthians.
Unfortunately, though, it's not 1st and 2nd exactly chronologically. It seems like
You think
there's-
second's first?
No. I mean, I think
Oh,
it's
yeah,
first and
there's a
second,
bunch in
but I
between.
think there's at least one in between. There's probably one before First Corinthians. There are other letters, and Paul and
And
Romans.
he alludes to it in
Yeah,
First
he does.
Corinthians,
He
too.
tells this other letter that I wrote. We're like, what other letter? This is first. How can you have another one?
Right. Point two.
Romans was written about the same time from Ephesus, from Corinth. Actually, I think he was in Corinth. He wrote Romans, and then maybe he wrote these later from Ephesus.
Yeah, and we
Something
know he
like
wrote it from Ephesus because we see it at the end of First Corinthians.
Yeah.
He says it. But kind of the cool thing here is, and I think why I like it is, it's so useful for us today.
Yeah.
So this church, Paul left on great terms, had a great ministry. Now these letters are written 3 to 5 years later, and things aren't so good.
Yeah.
And things aren't so good in the church. Where we've seen outside influences, certainly this is problems inside the church.
Right.
So we see Paul dealing with issues inside the church, which can help us.
Yeah.
And there's marriage problems, divorce, spiritual gifts questions,
Yep.
questions about the resurrection, and apathy in the church.
It seems like he does it in two sections. In chapters 1 through 6, he is getting stuff out that he wants to talk about. Mm-hmm. These are issues that he knows about or that he's heard about. Starting in chapter 7, it sounds like he's responding to some of their questions. Okay, here's a question, let me write about that. Here's a question, let me write about that. And so we've got two things going on, but like you said, it's a great insight into what's going, because the questions they ask, the things that he has to respond to.
Yeah, I mean, they happen today.
Yeah.
Really, it's kind of ageless, the type of questions that are in there.
Yeah. And the church, because of such a pagan influence in Corinth, the term Corinthian is great when it comes to sculpture, not so great when it comes to character. Back in this day and throughout ancient Greek history, a Corinthian, especially a Corinthian girl, was a name for a prostitute. That was a name for a really, really loose type of woman. She's just a Corinthian girl. Well, that tells you a little something about what Corinth is like.
Right. So Paul starts out nice in the letter in chapter 1. It's a normal letter. Hey, I'm Paul the apostle, writing to you. He also states who he's with, and what's the name? Sosthenes. More than likely, he is the same one that shows up in chapter 18.
Of Acts, right?
Yeah, of Acts, and he is the head of the synagogue.
Yeah.
Which is wild, right? So the head of the synagogue, and what he does is he and his fellow Jews attacked Paul.
Yeah.
Right? And they dragged him before the Roman magistrate, the Bema seat, if you would, there, or
right.
the judgment seat. And they said, this guy is bad, and they brought charges against him. And the Roman magistrate said, yeah, I'm not going to listen. This is
not my problem, right?
Yeah, this is not a Roman thing. You guys figure it out. And so Paul was free, and the Jews were so mad that they beat this guy up.
Yeah. They all seized Sosthenes, the president of the synagogue, and began to beat him in front of the judgment seat. Yet none of these things were any concern to
he
Gallio.
didn't care.
He's just
He didn't care.
Whatever, you guys take care of it yourself.
Yeah, but now we see that this guy has been transformed.
Yeah.
So somehow, and maybe we can read into it a little bit. Somehow, somebody proclaimed the gospel to this man who had been beaten up, or it could have been later than that. He accepted Christ, gave up Judaism, and now is with Paul in Ephesus. Yeah. So Paul thought enough about him that he took him on a trip.
Had him on his team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, how can you do that so quick? But if Paul's not going to trust somebody, I mean, Paul went through this exact thing that he went through, right? As a Roman, or as a Jewish leader, criticizing the church, and then they had a conversion and had spent years where people wouldn't believe that he was converted,
Yeah.
he would believe.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
If anybody's going to believe,
Well,
it
and
would be
let's
Paul.
not forget that the gospel and the theology that Paul was teaching was where Judaism was supposed to go.
Right.
So this is why he started in the synagogues with the Jews, is they already had all of this background. He was just giving them the next piece. You know the Messiah we've been waiting for? It's Jesus of Nazareth. He didn't have to start from scratch with the Jews like he did with the Gentiles.
Yeah. Yeah, so the letter starts out great, and then in verse 10 it takes a turn. Right?
Yep.
Turns out Chloe's household has told Paul that there's quarrels in the church. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't sound like a big deal. Right? But
Everybody has quarrels.
yeah,
right?
but Paul's in a different town, and Chloe thought enough that she sent people from her house, physically sent people
Yeah.
to go tell Paul.
Yeah.
So it was stronger than I'm just going to write a letter.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sending people. So this is a big deal
Yeah,
going on.
yeah.
here.
The church was basically being split into these factions, so that when they actually and probably had to do with maybe their house churches or whatever. But when they got together, they were actually like fighting. It makes me think of like a DNC or an RNC convention where you got your banner
Yeah,
and
with-
you're the
what's who you're for,
your
right?
candidate or
Yeah.
whatever, and that's what they were doing. I follow Apollos, I follow Paul, I follow Peter. I follow Jesus. And
Yep. And Paul comes back and he's like, "Is Christ divided?
Yeah.
What's the deal here?" So he actually takes a while to get through this.
Yeah.
There is some humor in here that
I mean, it's funny.
Yeah, I do too, and you probably pointed it out to me. But Paul says, "Look, I'm just happy I didn't baptize any of you guys. Oh wait, I baptized these two.
Yeah,
guys,
there were a couple
but
of
nobody. Oh wait, I baptized this family. Well, maybe." I don't know what I did. Maybe I baptized other people.
I wonder if
But
maybe-
my point is...
Yeah, I wonder if maybe Sosthenes was in the back. He's like, "Oh, don't forget Christmas."
Yeah.
It's like, "Fine, Christmas too."
Right.
Oh, and there was.
Right.
Shut up! I'm trying to make a
Well,
point
I
here.
think it's a good reminder, right? You got this letter going, and I'm old enough where I actually had to write things down.
Right.
And when you made a mistake, you tried to fix it, right? You didn't want to start over again, right?
Yeah.
You'd have to write everything again, so you tried to fix it. Not that Paul was trying to fix anything, but you could see the frustration there.
Yeah.
And we know that, inspired by God, definitely, but there's also the human element in here too.
And we have to remember that when we, especially in the letters, when we're talking about the inspiration, is that whereas the Holy Spirit, I love Charles Ryrie's definition, superintended the writing. This was not dictation. This wasn't Paul just receiving a dump from God and putting it on paper. This was a letter. This was Paul on paper, and the Holy Spirit was just making sure that whatever he wrote wasn't going to be incorrect or wasn't bad theology or however you want to put it. I love that back and forth when it comes to the doctrine of inspiration.
Yeah. So towards the end of chapter 1, or verse 17, Paul writes, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with clever speech, so that the cross of Christ would not become useless."
Yeah.
So I love that from the standpoint, and he says it in a number of different ways too, that he didn't come with elegant speech. He wasn't trying to wow people over with a big show.
Yeah.
He was just giving a plain gospel message and letting the words speak for themselves.
Now, some people take this to the extreme and say that, because Paul is the apostle of the Gentiles, the apostle of the Gentile church, baptism is not for today. We don't need baptism. We're not supposed to baptize because Christ did not send me to baptize.
Oh.
Baptism wasn't a part of Paul's ministry, even though just 2 verses earlier, he's like,
I baptized.
I baptized some people, right?
Yeah.
So I think we got to be careful, and we'll see this again in chapter 4. We got to be careful how far we take things. But there are some people that build their theology over no baptism and no baptism today because Paul said Jesus didn't send me to baptize, only to preach the gospel. So if you hear that, that's not where we go.
Yeah. So Paul talks about how God makes the wisdom of the world foolish.
Yeah.
And I love this story because he incorporates, hey, remember when you got saved? Did you know everything? Were you smart? Did you do that? No.
Yeah.
You didn't, but you believed, and God gave you the wisdom. God gave you these things, and God chose you anyways.
Yeah.
So why are you boasting? Just trust in the Lord.
I think it's interesting that, especially in these, like I said, the first 6 chapters is what Paul needed to get out, and then the rest of it is questions to answers, or answers to questions that they asked him. And these first 6 chapters are going to be so gospel heavy, and it's what we teach here. It's if you're wandering away from the path, it's not just a minor correction. Sometimes it means you got to come back and remember the gospel. 2 Peter says you've forgotten
the beginning.
You've forgotten your the cleansing of your past sins, right? Yeah, in Ephesus you've forgotten your first love. 2 Peter says you've forgotten the cleansing of your past sins. Sometimes we just need to remember the gospel to get us back on track. And so he's starting at the very beginning. Here's the gospel. In chapter 2, you've got to have the Holy Spirit. In chapter 3, you're acting like infants. You got to come back to this. Chapter 4, we're ministers of this. Chapter 5, how can you possibly think this way? And chapter 6 is pretty much the same thing. How can you possibly live this way? It all comes back to for the first 6 chapters, it all comes back to the gospel.
Nice. So you laid everything out. I don't want to rehash all of it, but in chapter 3, there's a discussion on a test by fire.
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
Well, I think this is the judgment seat of Christ, which
happens
after
late,
the rapture
right?
of the church, right? So Jesus is going to come back, take the church out, or take us to be with Him, and then at some point He's going to judge us. And it's not for salvation. It's not like, where are we going to go? 2 Corinthians, actually, and I love the fact that we have this in 1 Corinthians, and then 2 Corinthians 5 talks about that we have to appear before the judgment seat of Christ, where we will receive basically payment for what we did in this body, whether it's good quality or bad quality. And he uses words in 2 Corinthians 5, 9, and 10 for quality. Well, here he uses this illustration of building your life, building on the foundation. And he says the foundation is Jesus. The foundation is already set. So what are you building on that? And then he uses gold, silver, and precious stones, wood, hay, and straw. Good quality, bad quality building materials, right?
And then the fire.
And then everybody goes through, everybody's works, everybody goes through this fire. This is the one where I have always, ever since I was a little kid, imagined the angel with the flamethrower. Just, But God's holy fire, God has one holy fire. And when his enemies, like in Hebrews 10, his enemies go through his fire, they're destroyed, right? When his people go through his fire, we're purified. And 1 Peter 1 says that we come out like gold when we pass through, trials of fire. And the same thing is here too. And I think verse 15 is really the biggest key here. If someone's work is burnt up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved. This is not determining salvation. This is only saved people who will be here.
So interesting, from a conceptual standpoint, we put so much time in our jobs and work and everything, and it's so important to us. What's that going to look like?
Yeah.
Right. For most of us, it is wood and straw. Right. Our jobs don't really matter.
Yeah.
But in other cases, they certainly do. And somebody can even have the same job, and their thought process, how they act with it, what they do with it, can be completely different.
Yeah,
so it's not the job.
Yeah, it's not the job itself, right? You can have 2 people in the same office or in the same factory or in the same, home or whatever, doing the exact same work. And I really think it comes back to motive. Yep. Over in chapter 4, when he's still talking about this in verse 5, he's like, don't judge anything before the time. He's like, I'm not going to judge you. You don't judge me, right? Don't judge anything. We will stand before the Lord. Wait until the Lord comes. He'll bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the motives of hearts. I think motive is really what has to do with it. And then he says, then each one will receive, and the net says recognition from God. And I think that hides the fact that the Greek word translated recognition here is the same word that is usually translated praise. When we're praising God, it's the exact same word. So there is a sense that Jesus is waiting to praise us for what we've done for him.
Yeah.
That's a cool concept.
Right.
Right.
That
We
is
usually
amazing.
think of praise this
Yeah,
direction.
Yeah, but gives it back.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Well, yeah, good job, my faithful
faithful
servant.
servant, right? Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff in here, and obviously we're hitting very high level here. Chapter 2 talks about this wisdom of where do we get wisdom, and the wisdom from God versus the wisdom from men, and the fact that it takes a person who is spiritually in tune with God to understand spiritual truth.
Yeah.
And that fits along with our path and our spiritual maturity and everything.
Also, a key concept there is somebody who has not accepted Christ. Their interpretation of the Bible is going to be totally different than
Yeah,
yours.
yeah. How can we expect someone who is not even regenerated, has not been born again, who's not even spiritually alive,
Right.
to be able to understand spiritual truth,
Right.
right? So,
I get a question in chapter 4. There's a line in there that says, "Don't go beyond what is written."
yeah.
So, what's the context there? What point is he trying to get across?
So he just comes out of this thing about judging each other and all that. And in verse 6, he says, "I've applied these things to myself and Apollos because of you, so that through us you may learn not to go beyond what is written, so that none of you will be puffed up in favor of one against the other." So what is written? It has to be the Bible, right? I mean, in my understanding, right? So I love the fact that he says, my principle or my policy, and I've applied this to Apollos as well, who was a scholar, who was an orator, who was, a preacher type thing,
Right.
is what is written is what we stick with.
Yeah.
Don't go beyond that.
Yeah. So that's what we try to do today, right? Because there's places where you can extrapolate out. We may or may not be right, but it says don't go beyond that.
Yeah.
So it's, here's what we know, what is written. Now, do I think that's true? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's way different than here's what is written. So that means this has to be true.
Well, and that's why when we teach and when we talk, you and I both, and we try to do this, is if it comes from the Bible, it's non-negotiable. It's what it says. This is why we take a very literal, grammatical, historical interpretation. If it's my opinion, if it's my experience, if it's my extrapolation, if it's whatever, we try to make sure that we say that. If it's my opinion, do with it what you want.
Right.
If it's, no one cares what I think, no one cares what you think. We shouldn't. We should care what this says and make this the foundation. So,
Right.
Yep.
So then we end chapter 4 and our reading this week. Paul actually has some kinder words. so he switched back to daddy mode.
Yeah.
So in other words, he's a father. So he's saying, guys, this is hurting me more than it hurts you.
where have we heard that before?
Actually, I think I went beyond what the words say. But he only wants to correct their actions that he sees as wrong.
Yeah.
He's taking that fatherly view. And, he's taking it serious enough that he's also saying, hey, I'm also going to send Timothy to you.
Yeah.
And Timothy can be his eyes and ears too. So,
Yeah.
so definitely help. But he is taking their problems serious enough. And he ends up sending Apollos and Timothy.
I think
And
Titus is over
I was
there
going to say
too,
at least
yeah.
one more person too.
Yeah. Well, Corinth is really a great illustration of that old saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play, right?
Well, you stray, right? There's so many things to get your attention.
Yep. And so that's his whole thing. He's like, verse 18, some of you have become arrogant as if I were not coming. Paul's gone. We can do anything we want. He's like, okay, I'm not coming back right now, but Timothy's carrying this letter, and he's my eyes and ears, and he's my representative, and he will put things right.
Yeah. When he says, "And I will come," well, I'll try to come. God will tell me. And then he ends with, "Should the Father come to you with a rod of discipline, or with love and a spirit of gentleness?"
Yeah.
Just like a dad. How do you want me to come?
How do you want me to get home? Yeah. I'm coming home. What way do you want me to come home? Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Yeah. So great verses. I think you can see how these can be applied to us because, when the cat's away, the mice will play. So, we're like that.
Yeah. Yep.
Sometimes we get off, and sometimes, or often, we need to be corrected.
Yeah.
So it's not that you sin; it's how do you respond afterwards.
And there's a lot of really good stuff in these first few chapters. We're only going to be in 1 Corinthians for 5 weeks. So we'll be reading several chapters a week. Next week, there's some really ugly stuff. But for now, let's just get started with
That's next week.
Yeah, that's next time. But there's some really good stuff in here. A lot of stuff we didn't hit. So, but we'd love to hear from you. What is it that you see? What jumps out at you and really grabs your attention? What are the principles that you learned? And we'd love to hear that. And then, of course, what are the questions that you have? Maybe something that you'd like to learn about a little bit more. We'd be happy to answer that. Until next time, enjoy 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, and we'll see you back here soon.
Bye, everybody.